Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a case from the southeast of England, the case of Janet Brown. She was a married mother of three who tragically became the victim of a brutal murder in the mid-90s. Initially, when Janet's body was discovered, an immediate theory jumped out to the police as being the reason for her death. But when holes started to appear in this theory, the police realised that actually the motive for her murder was very unclear and still kind of remains unclear and unknown to this day, because to this day, approaching 3 decades after the crime, Janet's case sadly remains unsolved. Despite extensive police investigations over the years, her killer has never been identified. And so, as you guys know, with all of the unsolved cases that I cover, there will be contact details to the authorities in the description box below in case anyone watching this video has any information about this case. But just before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains themes such as violence towards women, sexual assault and stalking. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back, coming up to 29 years now, to the spring of 1995 in Radnage, which is a little village located in the county of Buckinghamshire in the southeast of England. And this is Janet Brown. She was a 51-year-old woman who, of course, lived in Radnage with her family. Janet was born on the 27th of January 1944 in Southampton. Sources state that she was an only child. Now, I can't really comment on what her childhood and her upbringing was like because there isn't really any information online that I could find about that. But by the time this case occurred in the mid-90s, Janet Brown was a woman who, for the most part, seemed to live quite a quiet life. She was married, as I said. Her husband was a man named Graham Brown, and Janet and Graham had 3 children together. They had a son named Ben and 2 daughters named Zara and Roxan. And Janet was described by her daughters as just being a lovely mum in general, to be honest. She was very kind and patient and gentle. She had a good sense of humour. Janet was said to be very good at like DIY and gardening. She loved growing her own fruits like strawberries. Her daughter Roxanne said that she was particularly very good at making her own strawberry milkshakes. Literally from scratch, she would make these milkshakes with the strawberries from her garden, which I just think is so cute. She loved to travel and visit new places, and she also loved just being out in nature. They were very fortunate that where they lived, they were surrounded by these empty fields. So Janet would love going for a nice walk around the fields. It was the simple things like that in life that Janet Brown just really enjoyed. And speaking of where the Brown family lived, oh my goodness, they had an absolutely gorgeous house. It was this big farmhouse called Hall's Farm. It was located on Spriggs Holly Lane in Radnage on an 11-acre estate. Like I mentioned, they were surrounded by fields, so it was a very remote and peaceful area to live. And according to sources, the house was valued at about £345,000, and that was in 1995. So I can only imagine how much it would be worth today in 2024. But I mean, Janet and her husband worked really hard for what they had. They both had really good jobs. Graham Brown worked as a medical doctor and senior executive for this big pharmaceuticals company in Switzerland, so he worked away a lot. And Janet worked as a research nurse in the public health and primary care department at the Oxford University. And apparently her main role as a researcher was to go through data which looked at infertility in women. So, I mean, clearly she was an incredibly intelligent person too. Outside of work, she seemed to be very passionate about public safety and preventing crime in her community. So much so that following quite a few local burglaries, she actually set up the neighbourhood watch scheme in her area. If you don't know what a neighbourhood watch scheme is, it basically involves members of a town or a village coming together and working together to try and reduce crime rates where they live, particularly crimes like burglaries and break-ins. I think by basically like entering a pact, I guess, to look out for each other's properties and keep an eye on each other's houses, and they do a load of other stuff too, just to try try and make their community feel a bit safer. As I said, Janet was very passionate about that kind of thing. She was extremely security conscious in general, and she had actually installed a panic alarm in her house. And that aspect of this case, the fact that she felt so strongly about safety and home security, I think is what makes what happened to Janet just even more heartbreaking. So let's go into the day that this case occurred. It was the 10th of April 1995, a Monday, and it was a day that initially seemed to be just like any other for Janet Brown. She had been to work at the Oxford University. It's believed that she probably left work as usual at around 5:30 that afternoon, and then that evening she was at her home on Spriggs Holly Lane as usual. It seemed as though she was in for the night. Now, Janet was home alone on this particular evening because actually by the time this case took place in April of 1995, it was only her and her youngest daughter Roxanne that were living at home. Her other two children, Ben and Zara, were both adults. I think they were both in their early 20s by this point, so they had moved out. They'd gone off to university and gotten jobs, and they no longer lived in the family home. And of course, as I mentioned, Janet's husband Graham worked in Switzerland a lot. He basically lived in Switzerland, and because of this, Janet and Graham had decided to sell their farmhouse. It was on the market. Obviously, they didn't need such a big house anymore with just Janet and Roxanne living there. So yeah, they intended to sell it, and then I believe once it had sold, Janet's plan was to move over to Switzerland with her husband. But on the night in question, the evening of the 10th of April 1995, like I said, Janet was home alone because her youngest, 18-year-old Roxanne, she had arranged to have a sleepover at one of her friends' houses. This friend had just passed her driving test, and so they were going to hang out and celebrate. And so Janet, just expecting to see her daughter the following day, eventually went to bed. However, when that next day rolled around, an absolutely horrific discovery was made in the Browns' farmhouse, actually by their builder. Because they were in the process of selling their home, the Browns were having a bit of work done on their property, just so that it was all nice and ready for the next owners. And on the morning of the 11th of April 1995, at around 8:10 a.m, their builder, a man named Nick, and also Nick's teenage son, they arrived at the Browns' address as they were obviously going to be doing some work there that day. And immediately when they arrived, when they pulled up outside of the house, they could hear this noise coming from inside of the house. It sounded like an alarm. It turns out that it was the panic alarm that Janet had previously installed. It seemed as though for some reason she had set it off. So Nick and his son started looking around, looking through the windows of the house, and when Nick's son looked through one particular window, he could see the dead body of 51-year-old Janet Brown. She was lying in a pool of blood on the floor at the bottom of the staircase. So of course, very quickly upon making this discovery, Nick and his son called the emergency services, and the police soon arrived at the scene. It was immediately clear to the police when they got there that Janet had been the victim of a brutal crime. It wasn't like she had, accidentally fallen down the stairs or anything. She had been murdered, and it was ultimately established that her cause of death was trauma to the head. She had been viciously beaten around the head with some kind of heavy weapon. Now, there was no weapon found at the scene, but the police believed due to her injuries that it was probably a crowbar that was used, and she'd been hit in the head with this crowbar about 4 or 5 times. She was gagged. Apparently packing tape or masking tape was stuffed inside of her mouth, clearly to silence her, and she was actually handcuffed as well. Her hands had been handcuffed behind her back, and as well as that, she was also found nude. She was lying naked at the bottom of the stairs, which would initially suggest that she had been the victim of a sexual assault too. Although, having said that, there was no evidence that Janet had been sexually assaulted, and apparently Janet would often sleep naked, so it was thought that that may have been why she was found nude. Perhaps she was attacked and killed after she had gone to bed. So if this crime wasn't sexually motivated, then what was the motive here? What reason did someone have for wanting to brutally kill such a nice, lovely woman like Janet, who seemed to live such a quiet, normal life? Well, upon looking around the house, the police quickly identified the motive as possibly being burglary. It seemed as though Janet's murder may have been part of a robbery attempt. You see, it was found that to get into the house, the killer had actually tried to use some kind of glass cutting equipment that they brought with them to the scene, and using it, they tried to cut a man-sized hole out of one of the patio doors to get inside, which really confused the police because, of course, that is quite a time-consuming process to try and cut their way inside. And something else which just added to the confusion was the fact that it was also found that after cutting this man-sized hole, the killer actually used this unusual tape. It was called all-weather sellotape, and it's often used on like greenhouses and stuff because it's waterproof, I think. They used this to tape back up, or attempt to tape back up, the man-sized hole. Again, a very time-consuming process. It's thought that they probably did this because after cutting the hole, they actually realised that the patio doors were double glazed. And so instead of having to spend even more time cutting out another hole through the second pane of glass, they just proceeded to smash their way in. But yeah, the fact that they didn't do that in the first place seemed very strange, or the fact that they didn't just smash one of the windows in the house to get in. For some reason, they decided to go through the double glazed patio doors. For some reason, they decided to go through the time and effort of cutting out the man-sized hole and then taping it back up and then just smashing their way in anyway. And it's believed that when they eventually smashed their way in, that was what probably woke Janet up and made her set off the panic alarm in the house. Sources seem to suggest that she may have been confronted by the attacker in her bedroom. But before we talk any more about the robbery theory, let me just talk you through the timeline that the police put together of that night and the time that they estimated Janet was attacked and killed. So we already know that on the afternoon of the 10th of April 1995, Janet left her work at around 5:30 p.m. The next thing that we know about her movements from that evening comes from a witness, a woman who was riding her horse along Spriggs Holly Lane, which is obviously where Janet lived, and this horse rider said that at around 6:30 p.m. she saw Janet in her car driving along Spriggs Holly Lane in a direction away from her farmhouse, and this horse rider told the police that Janet seemed to be almost a little bit preoccupied when she drove past her, because normally she would slow down when she saw her riding along the lane, but on this particular evening she didn't. Janet just drove at a normal speed as she passed the horse, so perhaps she was deep in thought about something and she didn't really register the horse rider, who knows. Approximately 10 minutes after this, at 6:40 p.m, it seemed as though Janet was back home again as she answered a telephone call from her youngest daughter Roxanne while she was obviously at her friend's house. During this phone call, Roxanne told her mum that she would probably be home at around lunchtime the following day, and apparently Janet said that she planned to have an early night that evening because she was feeling really tired. About an hour and a half following this, at 8:10 p.m, Janet answered a call from one of Roxanne's friends. I think she was just asking to speak to Roxanne, but obviously Roxanne wasn't there, and this friend actually seemed to be the last person to ever speak to Janet Brown, because sources state that shortly after this, sometime around 8:20, Nick the builder reportedly tried to call Janet's house phone just to ask a couple of questions about the work that he and his son were going to be doing the following day at the property, but he never got a response. No one answered the phone. And then at around 8:30 p.m, Janet's husband Graham also tried to ring the house, but again, no one picked up the call. So this suggested to the police that the killer, or killers, it's possible that there was more than one, they entered the house sometime after 8:15 p.m, and soon after entering, they attacked Janet. So as I said, the theory was in the very beginning that Janet had been killed as part of a robbery gone wrong. Maybe the perpetrator just intended to burgle the house, however, perhaps Janet saw their face or something, and so they panicked and decided to kill her so that she wouldn't be able to give the police a description of them later. However, on reflection, the police realised that actually there were a few aspects of this crime that just didn't make sense if this was a robbery. So firstly, I mean, we've already talked about this, but the fact that they initially tried to get into the house by using glass cutting equipment to cut a hole in the patio door. I guess perhaps they may have been thinking that this way of entry would probably create the least amount of noise, and therefore whoever was in the house wouldn't have realised that someone was trying to break in and call the police. But still, to go through that much time and effort, that's just not really something that burglars tend to do. Another thing that burglars apparently don't often do is actually burgle at night. According to one report that I came across, the most common time of day for house break-ins is between the hours of 10 AM and 3 PM, usually on weekdays, because of course that's normally when most people are at work and so no one is in the house. It's not actually that common for burglars to break in at night because there are always people in the house, especially around like 8:15 PM. As we know, that was the time that the police predicted the killer entered the house, and that is very early. It seemed as though Janet was probably in bed by that time because obviously she told her daughter Roxanne on the phone that she was going to get an early night. But I think it's fair to say that the majority of people are not typically in bed that early. Most people are still awake. So it seems like a very risky time for someone to attempt to break in, no? And also I think it's important to note that 2 cars belonging to the Brown family were parked outside of the house that evening. So the perpetrator definitely would have known that at least one person most likely would have been in the house, and yet they still decided to enter. In addition to that, there's the panic alarm. We know that the alarm was still ringing by the time Nick the builder arrived the following morning, and the police of course believe that Janet was the one who triggered this alarm. Apparently the Browns had 2 panic buttons in their home which would set off the alarm. One was near the front door and the other was right next to Janet's bed. And let's assume that Janet probably set off this alarm as soon as she heard the sound of an intruder, or when she was confronted by the intruder in her bedroom. It seems very strange that this loud alarm wouldn't prompt the perpetrator to just flee, get out of the house immediately. Most burglars would, but this one didn't. They still decided to gag and handcuff Janet and kill her, despite the fact that this alarm was going off and that there was every possibility that someone might hear it and call the police. It almost seems as though murdering Janet was their top priority here. Something else which didn't seem to support the robbery theory was the fact that specks of diluted blood were discovered on light switches upstairs in the home. So the police believe that the killer went to one of the bathrooms upstairs and washed his hands of blood in one of the sinks after killing Janet. Now, I'm assuming that Janet was probably killed at the bottom of the stairs where she was found, or around that area, because of the fact that she was in a pool of blood. I don't think she was killed elsewhere and then her body was dragged to the bottom of the stairs. I think she was beaten to death in or around this spot. So after killing Janet in this spot, the murderer went upstairs to wash his hands, which probably would make sense if this was a burglary, that they would go upstairs to see what things they could steal. But the main reason why a lot of people just don't buy into the robbery theory in this case was simply because nothing was actually stolen from the house. The only thing that the rest of the Brown family really noticed about the house that seemed a bit off was the fact that a television and also a video recorder had been unplugged. And I don't think Janet would usually do that. Normally she would just leave these things plugged in, so that seemed a bit strange. But they hadn't actually been taken, they'd just been unplugged. Nothing of value, or wow, nothing really, had been taken from the property. And you've got to remember that these were pretty wealthy people, and again, I'm making assumptions, but I would imagine that they probably had a lot of things that were worth a fair bit of money inside, such as jewellery or maybe a radio. We know that they had a television and a video recorder. Why would the perpetrator go through the effort of bringing glass cutting equipment with them to try and get into the house? And why would they kill Janet if they never actually intended to steal anything? The blood on the light switches upstairs and the fact that they washed their hands suggests that they spent time in the house after the brutal attack. But clearly, that time wasn't spent looking for things that they could steal. The house wasn't ransacked at all. From what I can gather, the police actually believe that the killer or killers may have spent up to 2 hours in the home after they first entered. Although it's believed that they entered after 8:15 PM, it's thought that Janet was killed killed sometime between then and 10:15 p.m. And I believe that one of the reasons for this was because, according to a Crime Watch appeal that was later released about Janet's case, a witness came forward to the police following her death, and she said that at around 9:50 p.m. that night, she was driving along Spriggs Holly Lane, and she said that as she passed Janet's farmhouse to the left, she noticed a car parked in an area just off of the road. And she kind of took a mental note of it at the time because of the couple of burglaries that had happened in the area in the lead up to Janet's murder, and also because I don't believe that that car was usually parked there. So thinking that perhaps this car was the killer's, she decided to get in touch with the police. So if it was the killer's vehicle, that indicates that they were still at the scene, still in Janet's house at 9:50 p.m, over an hour and a half after it's thought they likely entered the property. And you have to question why. If they weren't burgling the place, then what were they doing in the house for that long? And why weren't they in a rush to get out when the alarm would have been going off? It's so bizarre. And if Janet's murder wasn't a part of a burglary attempt, then again, what was the reason for this horrific crime? Who killed Janet Brown? Could it have been someone that she knew? Was this murder personal? Of course, one of the people that the police had to look into as possibly being a suspect in the case was Janet's husband, Graham, because as we know, the spouse is always one of the first people that the police look at in murder cases. I did read on one source that although Graham and Janet were still together, they were still married, they hadn't actually been intimate in quite a few years. So could that perhaps indicate that maybe the relationship had gone sour? But just to clarify, I don't know how true that is, as I did only read it on one source. The police looked into Graham, but they couldn't find any evidence whatsoever that he was involved in what had happened to his wife. And of course, he was in Switzerland at the time for work, and that was confirmed. They did look into the possibility that perhaps Graham or someone else had hired a contract killer to carry out this crime, but again, there was no evidence to support that, and there was nothing to suggest that neither Janet or Graham were having any kind of extramarital affair at the time. Now, there was no evidence of a violent struggle in the home or on Janet's body, really. It didn't seem as though she had put up that much of a fight or resisted, so perhaps she did know the attacker personally, and initially she felt safe with them. But then if that was the case, if the attacker did know Janet, why would they have broken in and not just knocked on the front door in the hopes that she would let them in? Although, having said that, maybe they broke in to cover up the crime and staged the scene to make it look as though it was a burglary to throw the police off, when in fact it wasn't. Something that would possibly indicate that the scene was staged was that, according to one report, a lot of the glass from where the patio doors had been smashed was actually on the outside of the house, as if they had been smashed from the inside. So if that's true, clearly that was a mistake on the killer's part, them smashing it on the inside to stage the scene. But again, that was only on one report, so take that information with a pinch of salt. Whether it was a botched burglary or not, what is clear is that the killer came to the house that night very prepared. They'd clearly thought this crime through because they brought a glass cutter, they brought this all-weather sellotape and masking tape, they brought handcuffs to restrain Janet, they brought presumably a crowbar, the weapon that the police believe was used to kill her. So this crime really seemed to be premeditated. It has been suggested that despite the fact that Janet hadn't been sexually assaulted, the motive for her murder was still sexual. Perhaps the killer got sexual gratification just from inflicting pain and fear among women. Maybe that's why Janet was naked at the bottom of the stairs. I mentioned briefly before that she did apparently normally sleep nude, however her dressing gown was found on her bedroom floor. So maybe when she heard the patio doors shattering, she grabbed her dressing gown and put it on, and when she was confronted by the killer, possibly in her bedroom, perhaps it slipped off when she maybe tried to run away from them, or maybe she was forced to remove it so that, again, the killer could get sexual gratification. But another theory that I've seen floating about online is that perhaps Janet's daughter, 18-year-old Roxan, was actually the intended target of this attack. If the killer was a local, let's say, and they were familiar with the family, or they had been secretly watching Janet and the house in the lead up to her death, they probably would have known that it had just been Janet and Roxan living in the home at the time, and maybe the killer wanted to attack and sexually assault, possibly even kidnap Roxanne, and so they expected her to be in the house that night. But of course she wasn't. She was at a friend's house, and upon realizing that she wasn't there, it was just Janet, the killer decided to just go ahead and murder her. Maybe they were angry that Roxanne wasn't there, and so they decided to take this anger out on Janet. And just as a side note, speaking of Roxanne, she has said since her mum's death that she actually feels so much guilt over the fact that she wasn't there that night, and the fact that her mum was home alone when this happened to her. Obviously most nights she was home with her mum, but it just so happened that on the one night that she wasn't there, the one night Janet was home alone, that was when someone broke in and killed her, which is just awful. It breaks my heart that Roxanne carries that guilt, because she couldn't have known that that was going to happen. She was just a teenage girl going for a sleepover at her friend's house, so the fact that she feels like she, I guess, let her mum down by not being there is just horrible. Following Janet's death, of course, the police appealed to the public for information. Janet's family, her husband and 3 children, did a public appeal. As I mentioned, the case was featured on an episode of Crime Watch. Everything went into, trying to spread awareness of Janet's murder as much as possible to hopefully get the tips and leads coming in. Now, one source states that about 10 months after Janet's murder, the police received 2 messages on their answering machine from an anonymous male caller who seemed to give information about Janet's death that the police deemed significant at the time. I don't know if this was ultimately established to be a hoax, because as I understand it, the police haven't really spoken about these anonymous phone calls much since, and there's not really much information about this particular aspect of the case online either, so I don't know what really came of that. A couple of years after Janet's case, it was considered that perhaps her murder was linked to the murder of another woman named Carol Ann Jackson. Now, Carol Ann Jackson was 50 years old at the time of her death, so around the same age as Janet, and she lived in a village called Woburn Green in Buckinghamshire. She lived alone, she worked as an antiques dealer, and she actually ran her business from her own home. And on the 11th of April 1997, so almost exactly 2 years following Janet's case, Carol Ann Jackson was brutally murdered inside of the little cottage where she lived. She was found bound and with horrific injuries to her head. It was clear that she had been beaten around the head, and that combined with asphyxiation was determined to have been her cause of death. One article from 1997 stated that the police believed she may have been suffocated with a pillow. Now, what's interesting is that in the lead up before Carol Ann's death, that she had actually gone to the police on at least 2 separate occasions telling them that she believed she may have had a stalker. She told them that she felt as though this man, this stranger, was following her. She'd seen him following her while she was driving, standing outside of her house, even banging on her front door. So of course this made her feel so uneasy. I imagine especially because of the fact that she lived alone. Much like Janet, Carol Ann also had a security alarm installed in her home, and as far as I'm aware, the police never found her stalker. They never identified who it was. But again, much like Janet's case, one of the main theories in Carol Ann's case in the beginning was that perhaps she was killed during a robbery attempt. Maybe her killer, possibly her stalker, found out that she ran an antiques business from her home, which included a lot of antique jewellery that would obviously be worth a lot of money, and so they decided to break in and try to steal it. Apparently a lot of her antique jewellery was kept in this safe in her house, and so the police theorised that maybe the attacker tried to force Carol Ann to give him the combination to this safe, and then following this he beat her to death and suffocated her. Although apparently the police were actually unable to open the safe to determine whether anything had been taken from it. I have a quote here from the lead detective on Carol Ann's case at the time. He said, "It is my firm suspicion that regrettably Ms. Jackson had been targeted by someone who knew what sort of trade she was in. Someone suspected she might have items at her home which would be of value. It is likely that they had been hanging around the area waiting for her, and indeed may have been in the area in earlier days or weeks." So yeah, because of the couple of similarities between Janet's case and Carol Ann's case, the possibility that the case cases were connected and that both women were killed by the same individual was explored. However, no definitive link has ever been made, and unfortunately the murder of Caroline Jackson also remains unsolved to this day. For years and years there was just nothing, no developments whatsoever in Janet's case. Her case effectively went cold. Despite a thorough police investigation at the time in the mid-90s, the detectives just could not identify who had done this to Janet Brown. But then in 2015, around the 20th anniversary of her death, her case was re-examined by the Thames Valley Police Major Crime Investigation Review Team, as they were hopeful that now, 20 years on, they may be able to use new, more advanced DNA techniques to obtain the killer's DNA profile, something which scientists were unable to do back in 1995, as forensic science was still relatively new and basic at that point, and thankfully they were able to. They announced to the public in 2015 that they had finally obtained male DNA from the crime scene of Janet Brown's murder, from evidence that was at the scene. This male DNA was not a match to the DNA of Janet's family members, so it was foreign DNA, and since then, since 2015, the police have tested this DNA profile against about 700 men, most of which I think lived in the area or surrounding areas at the time of Janet's death, but so far no match has been found. A reward of £20,000 was put forward by both Crimestoppers and the Thames Valley Police for information leading to the identity of Janet's murderer, and as well as this, in 2015, her two daughters, Roxan and Zara, who would have now been in their late 30s and early 40s by this point, they once again appealed to the public, urging anyone with any knowledge about their mum's death or who may have done this to her to please come forward. And then 5 years after this, in 2020, around the 25th anniversary of Janet's death, her daughters once again made another appeal with the Thames Valley Police for information, and it stated on one article from 2020 that the police also intended to use familial DNA techniques to identify potential relatives of the killer and try to narrow down the search for them via that. However, as of today in 2024, tragically, Janet's case still remains unsolved. And just next year in 2025, it will have been 3 decades since her murder, which is just awful for her family. I cannot even begin to comprehend the pain that they must have gone through when Janet was killed and still go through to this day, because they don't have any answers. They have no closure and no justice. But you know, the police are one huge step closer, it seems. They do have what we can assume is the killer's DNA, so hopefully it's just a matter of time before that match is found. It does appear as though, despite the evidence which seems to discredit the burglary theory, that is still to this day considered a possibility for the Major Crime Review Team. In 2015, Peter Byrne, the chief investigating officer, said, "My working hypothesis at the moment is that it was a burglar or burglars who weren't particularly proficient. They came across Janet, they had control of her because they handcuffed her, and I think she was bludgeoned to death when she pressed the panic alarm." So yeah, that is still one of the main theories in this case, but I would be interested to hear what you guys think in the comments. Given the evidence, do you think that this was indeed a robbery gone wrong, or do you think otherwise? And just in case there is anyone watching this video who thinks that they may potentially have information about Janet's case, you can contact the Thames Valley Police on 101 quoting the 1995 murder of Janet Brown, or alternatively, if you would like to remain anonymous, you can contact Crimestoppers on 0800 555 111. Those details will also be available for you in the description box. I know that a lot of my viewers are younger and therefore you may not have been around at the time of this case taking place in 1995, as I wasn't, but I think it's always worth sharing this video or sharing Janet's story with older relatives or friends that were around at the time, particularly if they lived in the Buckinghamshire area, because you never know, maybe they'll realise that actually they do know something that might be worth reporting to the police. As we know, sometimes in these investigations, even the smallest tip can lead to the massive breakthrough that the police are waiting for. And that is it for this case. That is the unsolved case of Janet Brown. Again, would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this case down below in the comments, and I'd also love to hear of any other cases that you would like like to see me cover on this channel. If you head to the description, you will find a case request form which you can fill out. I literally check that all the time when I'm looking for new cases to cover. But thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.